The wind screamed through the frozen night, sharp as a knife, ripping through the empty land. Lily McGraw, no older than 7, stumbled through the deep snow, her small hands trembling, trying to hold onto the last shred of hope she had left. With each step, the biting cold gnawed at her skin, the wind pushing her back as if nature itself was trying to stop her. She could barely see through the blinding snow, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she dragged her worn boots through the thick drifts. "Mama needs help," she whispered to the night, knowing the words were useless against the storm. There was no one for miles, no one to hear her call. Her stomach twisted with hunger, and the ache of her mother's absence was a dull, constant throb in her chest. The world was an endless expanse of white, suffocating her, pushing her deeper into despair. And just as the wind howled louder, her hands found the edge of a wooden gate, half buried in the snow. She stumbled forward, her heart pounding, unsure if the house on the other side was real or just a dream. Ethan Cole, the rancher, stood alone in his cabin, the flames of the fire barely flickering in the hearth. The storm had kept him awake for hours, the wind howling like a wild animal outside, a constant reminder of the world he had chosen to leave behind. His wife had been gone for 2 winters now, and he had buried her memory deep, like the land he worked, cold, hard, and unforgiving. His life was now a rhythm of chores and solitude, the silence of the land a constant companion. When the knock came, it wasn't the usual sound of a neighbor or a passing traveler. It was softer, more fragile, like the knock of someone who had lost everything. Ethan paused. He could hear the tremor in the air, a sense of urgency, of desperation. He opened the door, and the cold rushed in, biting his skin, but it wasn't the cold that made his chest tighten. It was the sight of the small, trembling figure standing there, barely able to hold herself upright, her face pale with the frost. Her eyes locked with his, wide and full of terror. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Mama needs help." The word struck him like a punch. Ethan stepped forward, instinctively pulling her into the warmth of the cabin, his rough hands steady as he guided her inside. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing them off from the storm outside. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but the warmth it offered was nothing compared to the sudden flood of emotions rushing through Ethan. He had spent years alone, burying his pain, telling himself he didn't need anyone. But this little girl, this lost, broken soul, had somehow managed to find him in the middle of nowhere on the coldest night of the year. Her presence stirred something inside him, something he thought had died with his wife. He crouched down to her level, his eyes searching her face for some sign of the world she had come from. "What happened?" he asked, his voice rough, as though it hadn't been used in years. But the girl only shook her head, her small hands clenched tight around the ragged hem of her coat. "Mama," she whispered again, her voice trembling, and Ethan felt his heart tighten. His life had just changed, but the question that lingered in the air was, how? How had this girl, in the middle of this frozen wasteland, come to him? And more importantly, what was he going to do about it? The cold air inside the cabin felt almost as sharp as the wind outside, a biting chill that clung to the walls, making the fire in the hearth seem almost powerless against it. Ethan watched the small figure of Lily, her back hunched, hands still trembling as she sat on the worn chair by the fire. Her face was pale, a mix of exhaustion and fear, but there was something in her eyes, a silent plea, not just for help, but for something more. She was a child, yet she carried herself like someone much older, as though life had already forced her to grow up. Ethan felt the weight of her gaze, but he didn't move. He couldn't move, not yet. The silence in the cabin grew thicker, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of the storm outside. His gaze lingered on her, the flickering light casting shadows across her face, softening the edges of her pain. But he couldn't escape the reality. She was vulnerable, and in this unforgiving world, vulnerability meant danger. And he, whether he liked it or not, was the only one who could protect her. "I'll make sure you're safe," he finally said, his voice deep, low, controlled. He spoke as though it was a promise he'd already made to himself, something he had to do, even if it meant opening old wounds. Lily didn't answer immediately, but she looked at him, really looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of uncertainty and trust. The distance between them seemed to grow even though they were in the same small room. She was still a stranger to him, but there was something about her, the way she had found him in this desolate place, that gnawed at his insides. Was it fate? Or just desperation? The storm outside seemed to answer with a gust of wind that rattled the cabin walls, forcing Ethan to stand up. His body was a wall of muscle and worn leather, a stark contrast to the fragile child before him. He crossed the room to add another log to the fire, his movements slow, deliberate, measured. He had been alone for too long to not know how to control his own actions. Yet, the longer he stood there, the more he felt the weight of her presence. She was still there, watching him. Her silence was as heavy as the snow falling outside. "You're not going anywhere tonight," he said, his voice harder now. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even a warning. It was an undeniable fact. Lily flinched slightly, but didn't protest. Instead, she nodded, and for the first time since entering the cabin, Ethan saw something in her eyes, something soft, something that spoke of relief. But beneath that relief was fear, and he knew it. She was alone in this world, just like him. The fire crackled again, the warmth from the hearth spreading across the room, but neither of them seemed to feel it. The tension between them was thick, palpable. Ethan could feel the pull, the need to reach out, but he held himself back. She was just a child, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down, not with the storm raging outside, and not with his own broken past weighing him down. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Ethan found himself fighting the urge to check on her again, to make sure she was still there, still safe. But he kept his distance, watching her from across the room, the firelight dancing in her wide eyes. Would he be enough to protect her? Or would the cold night take her too, just like it had taken so many others? He didn't know the answer, but the question lingered in the space between them, heavy and unsaid. Outside, the wind screamed louder, a constant reminder that nothing in this world was safe, and everything could be taken in the blink of an eye. And as Ethan stood there, the storm outside mirrored the storm inside him, a whirlwind of desire to protect this small, fragile life, and the fear that doing so might cost him more than he could ever give. But could he ignore the way his heart twisted whenever she looked at him, her eyes filled with trust, with need? The wind continued to howl outside, a constant reminder of the storm that raged beyond the cabin walls. Inside, the fire crackled weakly, its warmth barely enough to cut through the bitter cold. Ethan watched the small figure of Lily, her face drawn with exhaustion, as she sat on the edge of the bed, hugging her knees to her chest. Her eyes never left him, but there was a distance in them, a barrier he couldn't cross. He could feel it, just like the cold that wrapped around his own heart. He knew she didn't trust him completely yet, and he understood why. She had been abandoned, just as he had once been. But the difference was that she had no one else left to turn to. He was all she had, whether she liked it or not. The tension between them was thick, almost suffocating. Ethan stepped closer to the fire, his boots scraping against the wooden floor, but Lily flinched, just slightly, just enough to notice. It was a subtle movement, but it spoke volumes. Her fear wasn't just of the storm, of the cold. It was of him. The protector she needed, but also the stranger who was now her only hope. He hated how it felt, knowing she didn't trust him, that she saw him as just another man who might hurt her. But he couldn't push her. Not yet. He had to be patient. He had to earn her trust. He took another step closer, the space between them shrinking with each silent second. Her breath quickened, and he could feel it. The raw, unspoken tension in the room was nearly palpable. His gaze flickered to her hands, clenched tightly around the edges of her coat. She was scared of him, of the world outside, of what she might have to do to survive. Ethan reached out, slowly, his hand hovering just above hers, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. He wanted to touch her, to comfort her, but he knew better than to make the first move. Lily's eyes shot up to meet his, wide with a mix of fear and something else, something unspoken, but undeniable. He saw it then, a flicker of something fragile beneath the walls she had built around herself. "You're safe here," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. It was a promise, but also a plea. The room seemed to hold its breath. She didn't answer, but for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller, like she was allowing him in. He stepped back, wanting to respect her space, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. He couldn't let her go. Not when she was so close to breaking, so close to finally trusting him. But the question still loomed in the air. How far would he go to protect her? Would she allow him to be the shield she needed, or would her fear of abandonment keep her locked in this emotional cage, unable to accept the safety he offered? The storm outside howled louder, and Ethan knew that if he didn't find a way to reach her soon, he would lose her, just like everything else in his life. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the room, and for a moment, he wondered if they were both trapped in the same storm, battling the same cold, the same loneliness. And then, as if on cue, Lily spoke, her voice shaking. "What if I'm not strong enough?" The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin's walls, the wooden beams groaning under the weight of the storm. Ethan stood by the fire, his broad back to the light, casting a long shadow across the room. The heat from the flames danced, illuminating his face, but the rest of the room remained shrouded in darkness. Lily was still seated near the fire, her legs tucked beneath her, but there was something different in the air tonight, something charged, as if the very space between them had thickened. The silence was unbearable, stretching between them like a rope pulled too tight, ready to snap. Lily shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flicking to him, and for the first time, Ethan saw the defiance in her gaze. It was faint, hidden beneath the layers of fear and exhaustion, but it was there. She wasn't going to simply sit back and let him control everything. "You don't have to keep me here," she said, her voice trembling but steady. It was a challenge, not a plea. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. The space between them seemed to shrink even more, the weight of the words hanging in the air like the storm outside. He hadn't expected this. The girl, vulnerable and broken, had found a spark of rebellion. "You don't know what it's like out there," Ethan said, his tone low, controlled. He moved closer, his boots silent against the wooden floor, but there was a quiet authority in his steps. Lily didn't flinch, but she didn't look away either. Her posture remained rigid, her body language a mixture of vulnerability and strength, like a wild animal unsure whether to trust the hand offering help. "I know enough," she replied, her eyes locking with his, an unspoken understanding passing between them. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, but he hesitated. There was something in the way she held herself, something that told him she wasn't ready. "You're not safe out there. Not in this storm." His voice softened, the usual sternness replaced with something that almost felt like compassion. But it was buried beneath layers of control, like a man who had learned to keep his feelings buried deep inside. Lily looked up at him, her breath shallow, but there was no fear now, just a quiet determination. "I'm not asking for your help," she said, almost too quietly. "I'm asking for a choice." The words hit him harder than any storm could. A choice. Ethan stepped back, his jaw tightening. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had to keep control. She was just a girl. But she wasn't just that. She was a survivor, just like him. The room grew colder despite the fire. Ethan's chest tightened, and for a moment, he thought he might lose his composure. His hand clenched into a fist at his side, the instinct to protect rising within him, but he forced it down. He had learned to control that part of himself. "You think you can survive out there on your own?" he asked, his voice low and steady, but there was something raw in the way he looked at her now, something that showed more than just his need to keep her safe. Lily didn't answer right away. She met his gaze, her eyes full of something he couldn't read. The silence stretched longer, and then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can, but I have to try." Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. The air between them crackled with tension, like a live wire ready to snap. Her defiance, her strength, it was drawing him in, more than he had ever expected. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her, his presence filling the small space between them. She was so close, just inches away, and yet the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "You don't have to try alone," he said, his voice almost a whisper now, his control slipping. He reached out, his fingers grazing her arm lightly. A gesture of reassurance, of protection, but it was more than that. It was an acknowledgement of the bond that had already begun to form between them. She looked up at him, her breath shallow, and for the briefest moment, their gazes locked. The storm outside raged louder, but inside, the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. The question still lingered. What would she choose? Would she stay, or would she walk away, back into the storm? The silence between them was broken only by the howling wind, and in that moment, Ethan knew that whatever happened next, everything was about to change. The storm outside howled louder, the wind scratching at the cabin's wooden walls like the claws of a wild animal. Inside, the fire crackled, its warm glow casting fleeting shadows across the room. Ethan stood near the hearth, his broad frame outlined in the flickering light, but Lily could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The heat from the fire barely reached her as she sat, still, near the far wall, her gaze never straying far from Ethan. The space between them had shrunk, but the invisible barrier of control and restraint remained, pressing down on them both. Her heart was racing in her chest, the same as his, but for different reasons. He had taken her in, protected her, but she could feel it, the way he watched her, with care and caution. He wasn't letting go, and neither was she. Ethan moved towards her, slow, deliberate, his boots silent against the floor. As he reached her, the room seemed to close in. The warmth from the fire bathed his face, but the coolness of the night clung to his body, giving him the appearance of a man caught between two worlds. Lily didn't flinch, but she couldn't bring herself to speak either. The silence was unbearable, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. Lily. Ethan's voice was low, filled with a controlled strength. You have to understand. It's not safe out there. Not anymore. She didn't look at him right away, her hands fidgeting in her lap. But then her gaze met his, a flicker of something raw in her eyes, a mix of fear and something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. I know, she whispered, but the words felt empty, like a truth she wasn't ready to admit. The distance between them wasn't just physical now. It was emotional, a barrier she wasn't sure she could cross. I didn't ask for this, she added, her voice trembling but firm. The words hung in the air, but Ethan didn't move away. Instead, he crouched down in front of her, bringing their faces to the same level. The warmth of the fire danced across his features, softening the edges of the tension in his jaw. I know, he replied quietly, but I'm not going to let you walk out there. Not in this storm. He reached out, his hand brushing against her arm, the touch light but full of intent. The sensation lingered, the warmth of his hand seeping through the fabric of her coat, and for a moment, Lily didn't pull away. But the silence stretched between them again, this time filled with something else, an unspoken understanding that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. She was scared, not just of the storm, but of what she was beginning to feel. Ethan's protective instincts were clear, but so was the hunger in his eyes. It was a hunger he tried to bury, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface, and she could feel it. The air between them was thick, charged with something neither of them could escape. He couldn't keep pretending it wasn't there. The pull between them, the magnetic force that was slowly drawing them closer, even as they fought it. You're not alone here, Ethan said again, his voice almost pleading. It wasn't just a statement. It was a promise, but also a confession. Lily's heart thundered in her chest, and for the first time, she realized how much she needed him, how much she feared being alone in this world. She took a shallow breath, her eyes not leaving his, and for a fleeting moment, the distance between them disappeared entirely. But then, just as quickly, the walls she had built inside herself slammed back into place. She had come too far to let herself be consumed by this, by him. I don't need your pity, she said, her voice stronger now, more certain. It was the only defense she had left. But even as the words left her mouth, she saw the hurt flash across Ethan's face, and for the first time, she wondered if she had made the wrong choice. He didn't speak, but the silence between them became heavier. Ethan's eyes softened, but the protective steel behind them remained. He wasn't giving up on her, not yet. The storm outside raged harder, but inside the cabin, the temperature was rising. Asterisk, and neither of them knew just how much longer they could keep fighting it. Asterisk, the wind outside had shifted, now howling with an almost ferocious intensity. The snow had thickened, the world outside reduced to a blur of white, and the cold seeped deeper into the cabin, curling around their bones like a predator waiting to strike. Ethan stood near the window, his face bathed in the dim light from the hearth, his eyes scanning the storm beyond. Every inch of the world outside felt like a threat now. The fire had begun to die down, and the wood in the stove was running low. Supplies were scarce. The storm had cut them off from the world. The isolation felt suffocating, the silence inside the cabin broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howls of the wind. Lily was curled up in the corner, her small frame tucked tightly in her coat, her eyes dark with worry. The storm was worsening, and she knew what that meant. They couldn't stay here forever. They had no food left, no water, no escape. Ethan turned from the window and caught her gaze across the room. The tension between them had thickened, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. She had become more than just someone he was protecting. He could feel it, the shift in their dynamic. Lily no longer saw him as just a stranger, as just a man keeping her safe. She was beginning to depend on him, and the weight of that trust was something he wasn't sure he could carry, but neither of them had a choice. "We have to go," he said, the words like a knife in the silence. She didn't respond at first, just looked at him with that same heavy gaze, her lips pressed tight together. The fire flickered, casting shadows across her face. She wasn't just scared anymore. She was scared of him, of what she might have to ask of him. "We can't stay here," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. But there was something more there, something she wasn't saying. Ethan could feel her pull away, just a fraction, but it was enough to make his chest tighten. He had been her protector, her refuge, but now she was questioning everything. He could see it in the way she moved, the way she held herself. Her independence was slipping away, and neither of them knew how to stop it. Ethan stepped closer, but there was a hesitation in his movements. The space between them felt like a chasm now. Each step he took only made it wider. She had changed. He could see it. He could see how she was beginning to see him, not just as the man who kept the storm at bay, but as something more dangerous, something that could break her all over again. He didn't speak for a moment. His hand rested against the wall, the rough skin of his fingers brushing the splintered wood. His thoughts were racing, but his expression remained controlled, unyielding. "I can't keep you here, Lily," he said quietly. "You're right. But out there," he couldn't finish the sentence. The storm outside was a reminder of the danger that still loomed over them. They were running out of time. Her eyes softened just for a second, and in that instant, Ethan saw something shift. Lily wasn't just a girl caught in the storm anymore. She was becoming something else, someone who would have to make a choice. And that choice would either bind them together or tear them apart. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of the wind. The rawness in her voice made Ethan's chest ache, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together, the vulnerability in her movement striking him hard. The wall between them cracked just a little, the bond between them shifting in ways neither of them could control. But as much as he wanted to reach out, to tell her everything would be all right, he knew it wouldn't. Not until they made a choice. Not until they faced what was coming next. The storm outside raged louder, and the fire sputtered one last time before the light dimmed. Everything had become darker, colder, and so had their choices. The storm outside had reached its peak, the wind screaming with a ferocity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Snow whipped against the windows in wild sheets, and the once steady glow of the fire now flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the room. Ethan stood by the window, his eyes fixed on the fury outside, his breath heavy in the still air, rising like smoke into the cold. Lily sat near the fire, but there was nothing comforting about the warmth anymore. The cabin felt like a prison, the walls closing in on them both. The silence between them had grown unbearable, thick with unspoken words and emotions neither of them was ready to face. They were at a breaking point, both physically and emotionally. The storm wasn't just outside. It was inside them, too. Lily couldn't stay here anymore, but she couldn't bring herself to leave either. She was trapped between two choices, two fears. The fear of the unknown beyond the cabin's walls, and the fear of what staying here with him might mean. Her heart beat erratically, torn between the two. Ethan sensed it, the shift in the air, the way her body had become taut, as if she were holding herself together by sheer will alone. He hadn't expected this moment, but here it was, and they were both caught in it. She had been relying on him, trusting him to keep her safe. But now, something else had begun to take root in her. Something that made her question everything. He could see it in her eyes. She was scared to stay. Scared to trust him completely. He took a step toward her, the crunch of his boots on the floor loud in the silence. Lily looked up, her eyes locking with his, and for a fleeting second, neither of them moved. The air was thick with tension, the kind that pressed down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. "Lily," Ethan said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You don't have to make this choice alone." He stopped, the words hanging in the air between them. She didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. She wasn't ready to admit the truth. Her fear of leaving, her fear of staying, it was all the same. Ethan stood just inches away from her now, his presence overwhelming, yet not threatening. His hand twitched at his side, wanting to reach out, but holding back. He could feel the space between them, the invisible wall that neither of them had been able to break. "What happens if I stay?" Lily finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind outside. Her gaze never wavered from his, searching for something. A reason to trust him, a reason to stay, or a way out. Ethan swallowed hard, his chest tight, his eyes never leaving hers. He wanted to tell her everything would be all right, but he didn't know if it would be. He couldn't promise her that. "You'll stay safe," he said quietly, the words falling from his lips before he could stop them. But even as he spoke them, he realized they meant more than just shelter from the storm. They meant something deeper, something neither of them had dared to say out loud. Lily looked down at her hands, still trembling, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might say something that would break them both. But instead, she stood up, her movements slow but deliberate. The room seemed to contract around them, the space between them shrinking as she approached him. Her gaze flickered to the door, to the storm outside, but she didn't move toward it. She was still here, still standing in front of him. Her body was tense, coiled like a spring, and, for a moment, Ethan wondered if she was going to walk out into the storm, if she would choose to leave. But instead, she stepped closer to him, her eyes steady on his. The distance between them felt like a spark waiting to ignite, the air charged with a mix of fear, desire, and something deeper, something neither of them was ready to admit. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," Lily said, her voice cracking, but her eyes locked with his. A silent plea for something. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, the pull between them undeniable. He reached out then, his hand hovering just above her arm, the warmth from his skin seeping through the cold air. The moment stretched, hanging there in the heavy silence, and neither of them knew what would come next. Then, the wind outside howled louder, rattling the windows, as if it were answering for them, reminding them of the choice they had to make. Would they face the storm together? Or would they be torn apart by their own fears? The fire flickered weakly, casting long, trembling shadows against the cabin walls. Ethan sat on the edge of the small wooden table, his hands resting flat on the surface, the warmth from the dying embers barely reaching him. Lily stood near the window, her face half shadowed by the dark, her eyes fixed on the storm outside. The howling wind rattled the glass, but inside, the air felt still, suffocating. The tension had settled, but it wasn't gone. It was thick, like the smoke curling up from the fire, slowly drifting upward, but never completely fading away. They hadn't spoken since the moment had passed, the moment that had shifted everything between them. Neither of them knew how to bridge the silence now, or whether they even could. Ethan could feel it, the space between them. It was wider than ever, despite the fact that they were still in the same room, still breathing the same air. The fire crackled, its warmth too weak to push back the cold creeping in from the edges of the cabin. His eyes moved to Lily, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light, her back turned to him. She was avoiding him. The distance between them felt like a canyon now, even though they were so close. Her presence was a weight on him, a constant reminder of the choice that had been made, the choice that neither of them had been ready to face. He had protected her, yes, but now, he had been the one left exposed. He wanted to speak, wanted to bridge the gap, but every word felt wrong. "Lily," he finally said, his voice rough from the silence. She didn't turn around. Her shoulders were stiff, her head slightly lowered, as if the weight of her thoughts was too much to carry. I didn't mean to, his words trailed off. What was there to say? The damage had been done, the distance between them had been set into motion, and nothing would be the same. Lily's voice came, barely a whisper. I know, she said, her words heavy with an emotion Ethan couldn't read. She didn't move, didn't even acknowledge him. The only sound was the wind, still howling outside, and the faint crackle of the fire as it fought to stay alive. Do you? Ethan's question hung in the air, full of doubt, full of a regret he couldn't place. Lily finally turned, her eyes meeting his for the first time since the storm had broken them. Her face was pale, but her eyes, her eyes were full of something raw, something broken, but something real. I don't know what I feel anymore, she whispered. Ethan felt the words hit him harder than the storm ever could. Her voice trembled, but there was no anger in it, only a quiet resignation. She was as lost as he was. She was in pain, just as he was, but neither of them knew how to heal it. He stood up slowly, his boots heavy on the floor, as if the very act of moving was an effort. He crossed the room to her, but kept a careful distance. The air between them felt charged, heavy with all that was unsaid. He reached out then, but it wasn't a touch of comfort, not at first. His hand hovered just inches from her arm, the movement slow, deliberate, as if waiting for permission he wasn't sure would come. Lily didn't pull away, but she didn't welcome the touch either. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and in that moment, Ethan knew. She was already gone, not physically, but emotionally. And the silence between them was no longer just the quiet of the storm outside. It was the silence of something broken, something irreversible. Then, a soft thud sounded against the door. It was subtle, but it was enough to make both of them freeze. The sudden noise shattered the fragile stillness between them. Ethan's hand dropped to his side, his senses instantly on high alert. Lily's eyes snapped to the door, fear flickering in her gaze. The storm outside had done nothing to quell the danger that lingered, waiting just beyond the walls. A presence was out there, something they couldn't control. And with that presence came the stark reminder. No matter what they felt, no matter what they wanted, the world outside was still coming for them. The wind howled even fiercer now, clawing at the cabin's walls, as if the storm itself sought to tear everything apart. Inside, Ethan stood near the door, his hand resting on the cold wood, his eyes distant, looking beyond the storm, as if searching for something he could not see. The air between him and Lily had shifted again, this time heavier, taut with an undercurrent of tension neither of them could deny. They had both been running from the truth, but now, it was standing in front of them, staring them down. Lily watched him, her eyes sharp, her expression unreadable. She hadn't said much since the sound outside, and neither had he. The silence was deafening, louder than the storm, louder than the pounding of her heart. Then, without warning, she moved, walking across the room with a purpose that caught Ethan off guard. She stopped a few feet away from him, their eyes meeting for the first time in what felt like days. Her gaze held no fear, no hesitation. It was firm, steady, and there was something new in it, something he couldn't quite place, but it was unmistakable. Lily took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling in the stillness of the room. The air was thick with unspoken words, the weight of decisions both past and present pressing down on them. You're wrong, she said quietly, but her voice carried. Ethan turned to face her, his eyes narrowing slightly. The words hung in the air between them, a challenge, an invitation, he wasn't sure which. You think you're protecting me, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was a strength in it, a quiet power that Ethan hadn't seen before. But, you're just controlling me. Ethan flinched, the words stinging more than he had expected. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The truth of her words settled in like a heavy weight in his chest. Lily wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't the helpless girl in need of protection. She was standing her ground, and that shift, that change in her, it was like a quiet explosion, reverberating through everything between them. I never asked for this, she said, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that felt almost like a challenge. The ground beneath his feet shifted, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, Ethan felt something other than control. It was fear, fear of losing her, Fear of the unknown that now stretched out in front of him, but also something else. Something raw and unspoken. Asterisk asterisk, he took a step forward, but his hand stayed at his side, a careful distance between them. His pulse quickened, the sound of the storm outside blending with the pounding of his heart. "What do you want me to do?" His voice was low, strained with something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. The storm outside seemed to crescendo, and Lily's gaze softened just for a moment. The walls she had built around herself now coming down just enough for him to see a flicker of vulnerability. But it was quickly masked again by something stronger, something that made her stand taller. "I want you to stop making decisions for me," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. Ethan felt the weight of her gaze, heavy with expectations, and for the first time, he realized just how much she had been carrying. She wasn't asking for rescue. She was asking for freedom, and that was something he hadn't known how to give. He couldn't protect her from everything, and now, more than ever, he understood that. The silence between them was thick now, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a space between them, charged with everything they had yet to say, everything that had been left unsaid. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, there was a loud knock at the door. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. It was something or someone else. The sound cut through the room, the moment between them shattering in an instant. Ethan's hand shot to the door, his body tense, every muscle coiled in preparation. Lily's eyes widened, and in that moment, everything shifted again. The world outside was no longer something they could ignore. The storm outside howled with a savage intensity, the snow biting through every crack in the cabin, swirling like a living thing intent on tearing everything apart. The fire had nearly died, its faint glow casting long, wavering shadows on the walls, but the heat was almost gone, leaving only the cold to gnaw at their bones. Inside the cabin, Ethan stood facing Lily, the tension between them so thick, it felt like they were suffocating in it. Every inch of space seemed to hold the weight of their unspoken words, their unasked questions. Her breath came in shallow gasps, matching the pounding of his heart as they both stood on the edge of something neither of them was ready to confront. Outside, the storm raged, but in the silence of the cabin, there was a different kind of storm. Lily moved toward the door, her body stiff with the weight of the decision she had to make. Ethan's eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The air was heavy with the possibility of what might come next, a choice neither could ignore. The world outside was a cold, unforgiving place. But inside the cabin, the real choice was the one between them. Asterisk asterisk, the choice to stay or leave asterisk asterisk, to face what was waiting for them outside, or to find solace in the unbearable silence of what they shared. Lily stopped just short of the door, her hand resting on the handle, but she didn't turn it. She didn't move to leave. Instead, she stood there, her back to Ethan, but her body language telling him everything he needed to know. She was torn. The storm outside screamed louder, but inside, it was as if time itself had stopped. The only sound was their breathing, slow and uneven, their hearts beating in sync with the violence of the wind. Ethan stepped closer, but his movements were measured, hesitant. The distance between them felt unbearable, yet neither of them could close it. His eyes were full of words he couldn't say, full of feelings he didn't know how to share. He was a man of control, a man who had built walls to protect himself, but those walls had started to crumble. Lily's shoulders trembled, the weight of everything pressing down on her. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The words hit him like a blow to the chest. Lily's voice, raw and vulnerable, was a stark contrast to the harsh, unyielding world outside. Ethan's heart clenched as he stepped forward, his hand hovering near her arm, but he didn't touch her. He couldn't. There was too much at stake now, too much uncertainty between them. "I know you are," he said softly, his voice rough, torn between wanting to protect her and wanting to let her go. But the choice wasn't his to make anymore. Lily turned to face him, her eyes wide, searching his face for something she couldn't quite put into words. "What if I leave?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the storm itself. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say. What if she left? What would be left of him? What would be left of them? He was losing her, and for the first time, he felt powerless. Her gaze softened, but the weight of it was unbearable. She wasn't just leaving him. She was leaving everything. And in that moment, Ethan knew that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The door was still closed, but their world had already begun to unravel. Then, suddenly, the sound of something from outside broke the stillness. Asterisk, asterisk, a distant sound, too close to ignore. Asterisk, asterisk, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the snow, slow, deliberate, moving closer. Ethan's eyes snapped toward the window, his body tensing instinctively, his protective instincts surging. "Someone's out there," he said, his voice tight with the realization that the danger was closer than either of them had anticipated. The storm had been the least of their worries. The presence outside was no longer a distant threat. It was here, and with it came the crushing realization that whatever choice they made, the consequences were no longer in their control. The storm wasn't the only thing they had to survive. The storm had passed, but its remnants clung to the air, cold and sharp, lingering in the silence that settled over the cabin. Outside, the horizon was slowly brightening, the first light of dawn, casting a pale glow over the world, but the cold still held on. Ethan stood near the dying fire, his shadow stretched long against the wall, his body tense, but there was no urgency in him now. Lily was by the window, her figure silhouetted against the lightening sky, her gaze distant but not searching, as if she had finally found some kind of peace. The tension between them had softened, but not disappeared. The space between them, once filled with the weight of unspoken words and emotions, now felt fragile, delicate. Neither spoke at first. There was no need. Ethan's breath came slowly, evenly, his chest rising and falling in the quiet morning air. He could feel it, the change. Lily's presence beside him was no longer just a reminder of what he had to protect, but something more. Something he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. Yet he was. She was standing in front of him, but not as the girl who needed him, not as the one seeking shelter from the storm. Lily had become something else, someone who had chosen to stay, someone who had chosen to trust him, despite the fear, despite the pain. She had faced her demons, just as he had faced his. The walls between them had fallen, not with violence, but with the quiet acceptance of what they had become in the aftermath of everything. Ethan turned, his eyes catching hers across the room, the same intensity in his gaze, but softer now. He took a step toward her, slow, deliberate. She didn't move, didn't pull away. She didn't have to. She was standing in her own truth, and for the first time, so was he. "I can't promise you a perfect world," Ethan said, his voice low but steady, his words like a confession. "But I can promise you this. I'll never leave you." The weight of his words hung in the air between them, but it wasn't a burden anymore. It was a gift. Lily's eyes softened, the guarded look that had once defined her now gone. She took a slow breath, as though coming to terms with the reality of what they had shared. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. There was a vulnerability in her now, one that matched the vulnerability Ethan had been holding back. She wasn't just someone who had been saved anymore. She had saved herself, and in doing so, had allowed him to save her, too. The space between them had all but disappeared, the air between them filled with something unspoken but deeply understood. There was no need for more words, no need to rush the moment. They stood there together, in the quiet aftermath, the storm outside still raging, but it felt far away now. The real battle had already been fought. They had faced the storm inside themselves, and they had survived it. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the quiet understanding that they had both changed, that they had both chosen to be more than what they were before. Then, as if to break the spell, a faint noise from outside reached them, the sound of something moving in the snow. Ethan's body tensed, his instincts flaring up once more, but this time it wasn't fear he felt. It was the need to protect, to hold on to what they had found in each other. The moment of peace had passed, but they were ready. Ready for whatever was to come next. The door remained closed, but for the first time, it didn't matter, because they were no longer running from the world outside. They were facing it together. And whatever came next, they would face it as one. And in that moment, Ethan realized the truth. It wasn't the storm outside that would determine their fate. It was the storm inside them that had already been weathered. The first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the wooden door, casting soft, muted beams across the cabin floor. The world outside was still, the storm having finally passed, leaving behind a landscape blanketed in snow and silence. Inside, Ethan sat by the hearth, the fire now reduced to embers, its warmth faint but still present. Lily stood near the window, her gaze lost in the quiet morning, her face illuminated by the soft light. But there was no hurry in her movements, no tension. The air between them felt different now, quiet, but full of unspoken understanding. They had both changed, in ways they hadn't fully realized yet, and now, in the calm that followed the storm, they had time to process what that meant. Ethan watched her, the faintest of smiles playing at the edges of his mouth, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something else there, a quiet acceptance, a kind of peace. Lily turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze, but she didn't say anything. The silence felt comfortable now, like an old friend returning after years of absence. Ethan's eyes softened. He knew the weight of the past had shaped both of them, but in this moment, they stood together, not as two broken people trying to survive, but as two people who had found something they hadn't known they were looking for. Lily moved away from the window, her steps slow but sure. As she approached him, the space between them, which had once felt too large to cross, seemed to close without effort. She paused just in front of him, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Her breath was steady, the morning air cool against her skin. Ethan stood, his movements deliberate, and for a moment, their eyes locked again. There was no hesitation in either of them now. What had been uncertainty, fear, and longing had transformed into something else, something that had no name but was undeniable. Lily reached out slowly, her hand brushing against his, the touch light but meaningful. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was just a touch, a shared moment of connection, but it was enough. It was everything. Ethan closed his fingers gently around hers, his hand warm against hers, grounding her, grounding them both. The quiet that followed was different from the silence that had once held them apart. This was a silence of understanding, of shared history. It was a silence that said everything without needing words. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. They were no longer two strangers bound by the same storm. They were two people who had chosen to stay, to face whatever came next together. Lily finally looked up at him, and there it was, the last of the walls between them crumbling, leaving only what was real. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady, stronger than it had been before. Ethan gave a soft nod, the weight of her words sinking in. There was a new sense of finality in her voice, something that made the weight of everything they had endured together feel a little lighter. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something more, a quiet, hard-earned trust that had been forged in the crucible of hardship. And in that moment, Ethan knew the storm outside had passed, but it was the storms inside them that they had survived. The world outside might still be unforgiving, but they were no longer alone in it. And that was enough. The sun began its slow descent behind the horizon, painting the vast expanse of the prairie in rich hues of gold and crimson. The wind had softened to a gentle breeze, the kind that rustled the tall grass and whispered through the scattered trees, carrying with it the scent of earth and open sky. Ethan and Lily stood side by side, watching the world stretch out before them, no longer confined by the walls of the cabin, no longer bound by the storm. The land was wide, endless, but it felt like home now, as if the vastness of the world had opened up just for them. Lily's hand rested lightly against his arm, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. It was no longer a gesture of dependence, but of belonging. She had found her place here, beside him. They both had. The past seemed distant now, washed away by the storm, the decisions, and the trust they had built between them. Ethan turned to her, his eyes soft, no longer hardened by the world he had carried alone for so long. There was no barrier between them anymore, no walls to hide behind. He reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady, grounding them both in the moment. "We're not alone anymore," he said, his voice quiet but sure, filled with the weight of everything they had shared. The words hung in the air, and Lily squeezed his hand in response, her eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding. They had both chosen this. Chosen each other, asterisk, and in that choice, something had shifted within them both. "I don't need to be saved," Lily said softly, her voice steady with newfound strength. But I want to stay. Ethan's heart tightened at her words, but it wasn't the same ache it had been before. This time, it was a warmth, a sense of peace settling deep inside him. He had thought he was protecting her all this time, but now he realized it wasn't just protection she had needed, it was connection. And that was something they had. Both given each other, something that had been forged in the fires of hardship and the quiet of the night. Lily stepped closer, and without a word, she nestled against his side, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. Ethan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her in, holding her close. The world around them had fallen silent, as if even nature itself had paused to watch this quiet moment between them. They were no longer running from the world outside. They had found their place within it, together. The tension that had once held them captive had unraveled, replaced by something deeper, something more enduring. The warmth of the fading sun wrapped them in its glow, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he could finally breathe. "We'll face whatever comes next," he murmured, his voice steady, a promise as much to himself as to her. And for the first time, he knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. As the last light of day faded into the night, the air cooled, but it didn't matter. They were no longer alone, and that was enough. The storm had passed, and they had found what they had been searching for all along. Not just survival, but each other. In the end, it wasn't the storm that defined them. It was the choice to stay, to trust, to belong. Asterisk, asterisk.